You know, it's been a while since I have had to sit down and read the text for scripture reading for the Sunday. And what I found out this week as I was doing that, what I remembered, in fact, was that I usually started sermon planning about a quarter prior to what I was preaching. And so those scripture texts, I would sit down and read. I usually take a week or two to do this. And I would just take the Bible and then look up what the assigned reading was and begin to read the chapters around those. Sometimes all of the gospel, like all of the Gospel of Mark, which is the gospel for today. And as I was doing that this week, I realized that orientation months and weeks ahead of time helped me in being able to form sermons. But I only had a week this time. And so my dependency on the story was strong and needing to go back and read it more than once. You know, story is really the essence of how Jesus taught. And when we read for story rather than for something else, we find that the story will reveal itself to us. And we do that with storytelling because it's a different way to learn. Rather than reading the biblical text as moral authority to tell us what's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad. Hear the difference? Quite frankly, probably most of us read it as moral authority instead of a story. Jesus told stories because stories dip deep down into our mind, our hearts, our souls, and our body, and they uncover and reveal for us windows of truth that we may not have seen before. And quite frankly, it doesn't make any difference what age you are. Whether you're a little one in Sunday school, learning those early stories that are filled with so much action, like Noah's Ark, and Daniel, and even Jesus walking on the water. They have something to teach us. And as our years gather on us, hopefully those stories unveil themselves to us into deeper meanings. So what is obvious, like Jesus walking on water, does not become the center point. Rather, what was Jesus trying to teach us about that story? And more importantly, what was Jesus trying to teach us about God and our relationship with God? As I was thinking about my sermon, I always write down a whole bunch of different titles for the sermon. And interestingly, this one, if you've noticed in the bulletin, is called "Clean Up on Aisle 1, Please." How many of you remember that saying? We still hear it sometimes, but for some reason in me anyway, and I even asked Larry, it's related to Kmart and blue light specials. But for some reason, and I asked him, I said, do you remember, was it clean up on aisle 5 or clean up on aisle 15? I asked somebody else, and they said, well, they thought it was aisle 5. But I decided to use aisle 1 for a reason today. And I'll tell you about that later. The stories. The stories for this week are more than just the gospel. There are stories that began actually for the assigned reading back in 2 Samuel and about David becoming a king. Now David was a lowly shepherd out in the hillside taking care of sheep. He sang, he played the lute. It was a lonely life. He was a young boy when he was called to be a king. and certainly not one people would generally think of becoming a king. The shepherds, after all, were some of that low life in that culture. Well, we hear the stories, we read it, and I invite you to go back into Samuel. It's a great story. And, there is a division between King Saul and David. But he comes to power, and David wants to build a temple to God. And Nathan was the prophet of the time, and he told David, God says, I don't need a temple. Don't you remember I came with the people with the tents and the tabernacles? So David relented. But he was told by Nathan that his son would probably build that temple. Well, humanity got the best of David, and the story goes on that he one day was out on one of his high patios overlooking the valley, and he saw this beautiful woman in her garden, Bathsheba. And his passions came to the fore, and he wanted her. And in those days and that age, kings could make that happen. And you probably remember the rest of the story. He not only brought her to his home and impregnated her, but he finally had her husband killed at the front lines of a military quest. And that hung heavy in his life, and Nathan called him to task for it. Life gets messy, doesn't it, in these stories? Even for the greatest of leaders. And then there's the stories in Mark. And as I was reading through the text, I went back to the beginning and just read through some of the titles in Mark that divided the sections. And of course it starts out with John proclaiming the birth of Jesus and the coming of Jesus. And then the baptism of Jesus and his temptation already. The beginning of the Galilean ministry. And guess what? We're only in the first 14 verses. That's a cue for you because Mark tells the story quickly. Things move fast. And one of the keys to that is he uses the word immediately a lot in the text. So we're jumping quickly. Then Jesus calls his disciples and he starts to heal. He heals at Simon's house, and then he preaches in Galilee, and he cleanses a leper, and then he heals a paralytic, and then he calls Levi, and then there's a question about fasting. So we see the calling, the preaching, the healing, being right in the midst of the people. And now pronouncement about the Sabbath. It's getting messy. Jesus and his disciples are out on a Sabbath and they're hungry, so they go and they start to harvest some wheat from the field to eat it. And those good law-abiding Jewish leaders came by and said, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath by plucking the harvest. And Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Breaking the rules, not a good thing. Then he healed a man with a withered hand, and then there was a multitude by the seaside. And Jesus appointed the 12 to go out. And then there was a question about who his true kindred was. His mother and his brothers and his sisters came by to see him, and he was outside teaching, and he's saying, these are my brothers and my mother and my sisters, the people. The parable of the sower and the purpose of the parables. Disciples just weren't getting it. A lamp under a bushel basket. You know that song, don't you? The parable of the growing seed, the parable of the mustard seed, the use of parables. Jesus stills a storm. And then in chapter 5, Jesus heals the demonic Gerasene. And a girl is restored to life, and a woman is healed. And then chapter 6, the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth. The conflict, the messiness is building. In fact, it's right here that we have the death of John the Baptist. Because Herod's wife wanted him beheaded. Because he told her the truth. She wasn't supposed to be married to Herod. And then we have the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. And that's only 6 chapters. Fast-paced. And showing us how Jesus lived right in the midst of the messiness. Well, it's another cleanup on aisle 1, isn't it? Kind of like our lives right now. It's kind of a messy world, isn't it? And I wonder, even now, what is going to be written? What are the stories that are going to be told about this time, 50, 75, 100 years from now? And how we humans were acting with each other, against the earth. What would it mean to do a cleanup on aisle 1 in this time? What needs to happen? Well, I said I was going to tell you more about that, why I chose aisle 1. I chose aisle 1 because the number 1 is what we generally think of as primary. It is that which is first in our lives. And we need to clean up the mess in order to see, don't we? You know, when you've spilled something on the floor or you've dragged dirt into your house, you can't see that beautiful floor that's there without getting that rag out or that vacuum and cleaning it up. So what is it we need to see today? What is it that we need to uncover in order to live right here in the midst of the mess? What new things? What new thing is God doing right now that we can't see because of the mess? Well, that first principle, in fact, Loyal read for you this morning. And I'm going to pick one particular verse. For by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not your own doing. It is a gift of God. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And it is not your own doing. It is a gift from God. Do you hear that? This grace that we live in, that in fact is in here, in the mess of this life, is God's grace. It is here. It is penetrating this world, even if we don't see it. There is a monk that lived in the 1500s, I believe it was, no, 1600s, Brother Lawrence. He wrote a book called Practicing the Presence. It's a simple, small book. And one of his quotes is that the divine presence occupies the here and now. If you are not aware of this, become so. The divine presence occupies the here and now. If you are not aware of this, become so. As I said, God is in the mess, in the ordinary. This time of the year, in the liturgical calendar, the church calendar is called Ordinary Time. And it's the longest section of the liturgical calendar. Not too many celebratory days like Easter and Christmas are there. Even Lent. And so the stories are grounded in living on earth. And grounded in the incarnation, God with us. The point of our Christian lives, to be reminded that God is with us. The divine presence occupies the here and now. If you are not aware of this, become so. How do we become so? How do we clean up this mess so we can see? Two things. By working and by praying. By setting aside time to be with God. And if you read the story of Jesus, if you just even speed read Mark, what are you going to see? You're going to see that very pattern. Jesus going out, preaching, healing, teaching, and then going apart to be with God in the mountains, and in the plains, in this Mother Earth, right here, right now. A friend of mine who wrote for an article called The Guard of the Heart said, Bob Mitschke, in this way, the ordinary events and ups and downs of daily life become the focus of our practice. It disposes us to let go of personal likes and dislikes and to accept painful situations as they arise. Then we can decide what to do with them and whether to modify, correct, or improve them. Monastic structures are not the path to holiness for lay folks. The routines of daily life are. That's where we meet God. Contemplative prayer is aimed at transforming daily life with its never-ending round of ordinary activities and to remain in God's presence no matter what is happening. And that's the work. To remain in God's presence no matter what is happening. He goes on to say there's three ways we can do this. The first is to place disturbing thoughts as soon as they arise into God's lap, or to give them to God as a gift. So when you have those negative things streaming through your brain, which is we all have all the time, and especially when we start to pray, just drop them in God's lap. Say, here they are, God. My attention is for you, not for that. And secondly, then to apply that attention to whatever you are actually doing. If you're doing something, concentrating on the activity or duty of the moment. Another teacher I listened to, Cynthia Basholt, who's an Episcopal priest, she said one day, when you're cutting something in the kitchen, notice your hand touching the knife and the knife touching the food, like an apple. Pay attention to that very act. It is amazing how the negative things just kind of float away when you concentrate yourself on that very act of what you're doing. Do that when you're out for a walk. Some of you probably already do that. Or when you're driving, when you're hiking. Plant your feet on the ground. Notice what they're touching. And then notice how that shifts you. And then 30 said, if you find you are unoccupied with disturbing thoughts arising, pick up a book or take some prearranged project. Just pick it up and start doing it. I know some women in this group who quilt, who knit, who cook. Those are all ways. And for you men out there, go and pound a hammer, and maybe you cook too. There's lots of ways for us to ground ourselves in this ordinary time that is the holy presence. And you know what? That is the real key. There is so much messiness in this world right now that is trying every which way it can to capture our attention and to divert us away from seeing God in the midst. It is our work as Christians of the way, as people in whom God's presence is, to show the world how to clean up the mess on aisle 1. For by grace you have been saved, and it is not your own doing. Even cleaning up the messes have to be led by God. Or, honestly, we'll just keep making more of a mess. Paul, in that letter to the Ephesians, dives deeply into this time. We're not so unique, are we? He talks about the divisions between the tribes of that time, how it was named as Gentile and Jew. And he said, at the point of Christ's incarnation, at the point of Christ coming to earth and being among us, and quite frankly, only showing us what was already true. That is the point of our lives. That is the point where the equalizer happened. And he says, there's no divisions anymore. Well, I'd like to have a talk with Paul, wouldn't you? But visions are just that. It's a vision laid by God before us, to work towards, to live into. And what does it take? It takes a change of heart. And only God can do that. Only God can do that. The older I get, the longer I was in ministry, the more I knew that. And so, let's begin, even right now, begin again to clean up the mess on aisle 1, because it's right there before us. Grace is sufficient for all our needs.